What wonder, then, that these Nantucketers, born on a beach, should take to the sea for a livelihood. They first caught crabs and quahogs in the sand. More experienced, they pushed off in boats and captured cod, and at last, launching a navy of great ships on the sea, explored this watery world. Moby Dick by Herman Melville.
A sperm whale on Nantucket meant money. It was the lifeblood of this island, and yet many Nantucketers never had the chance to see a sperm whale until it came back in the form of oil.
You know, on New Year's Day, when people are, sort of looking forward, this sperm whale comes on the shore at Sconset, and everybody rushes out there because I think everybody intuitively knew this was a chance to look back and somehow connect with their past and the heritage of this island.
The head case is a true challenge, really, because the whole industry is really based on an element that is not skeletal, and it's not here on the skeleton.
Right.
So
How
any
do
way
you-
that we
how do you present that?
How do you present that? It seems that it's critically important to the message of the whole museum.
Well, it was the last day of the year. It was New Year's Eve, as 1997 turned into 98. And word got around Sconset that someone had spotted a sperm whale swimming not 10 feet offshore right here in Codfish Park. So, people started spreading the word. People called each other. Somebody called us and said, well, let's go check it out. A bunch of us ran down to the beach. There it was, right there. I mean, this thing was so close that you had a feeling that you could just reach out and touch it.
I think people just wanted to see this animal that they'd heard about. It's such a part of the history of the island. To see a whale with their own eyes, I think, was important. People brought their kids, grandparents brought grandchildren.
I took my family out there to see it because you don't get too many chances to see an actual live sperm whale up close. I've been on the water since I was 9, so over 35 years now, and I've seen a total of 6.
It was magnificent, but it was obviously hurt, and it was struggling. And the surf was too rough for us to do anything about it, so we stood there watching, and we ran along the beach as the whale swam, trying to help it, but not knowing what to do. And we all felt connected to it, to this thing so primal and so wild. I mean, this was a sperm whale, and we all knew what that meant.
As dusk began to fall, it really made one huge effort and managed to get through several sets of breakers, and then just sort of disappear in sort of a southerly course out to the ocean. And it was kind of cool because everybody cheered. And we all had great hope that it might survive, but I think we all really knew that it wouldn't.
Anyone who knew the water well enough knew that whale wasn't going to last very long. But, people on the beach were hopefully optimistic, but it was pretty much a done deal.
The next day, it was discovered a little bit down the beach.
We struck a large whale and it took 2 lines. Mr. Peter F. Swain, our 3rd officer, got entangled in one line and was carried overboard and lost. The line was immediately out and we never saw the whale again. Captain George Washington Gardner, Jr., Whaling Ship Nantucket, January 22nd, 1842.
Well, without the whale, Nantucket would have been a very different place. It would have been a remote island where people did a little farming, did a little cod fishing, but it would not have been the place of destiny.
It was a very dangerous, risky business that took guys away from home for years at a time to all corners of the globe, and some of them never came back. Some of them came back poor. Some of them came back very wealthy, but it was a very risky business.
There was a great disparity in whaling, because if you were on the lowest rung, you didn't make much money at all. But if you were a captain, it was a way to wealth. It was a way to retire in your early 30s, the equivalent of a millionaire. It was also a way to earn respect on Nantucket, where young boys would look at you and say, that's what I want to be. I want to be like that captain over there.
This is the 67th anniversary of independence, and if I only had the value of the gunpowder that will be burnt this day by Americans, I should not care if I ever saw another sperm whale. But, as I have not got it, it would be very pleasant to get a large whale tomorrow. Isaac B. Hussey, Whale Ship Phoenix, July 4th, 1843.
Early the next morning we went back down to the beach, hoping that the whale had gone off, but there it was. I mean, this thing that had looked so huge swimming in the water was now on the beach, and it was pathetic. And now we could see exactly how huge this thing really was. And while it was certainly tragic for the whale to have died, there was also a kind of magic to it. We all stood around it, and it was kind of like a wake. And we all had time to think about this thing that the sea had given us. But now the question was, what do you do with it? What do you do with a whale?
The sperm whale looks like a tank. It just looks broad through the shoulders. It looks menacing. One of the things that I was struck by before we even began the cutting in process was just how scary the whale looked.
They'd be out on the rolling oceans, way out in the Pacific Ocean, miles from land, and you're trying to attach yourself to this gigantic animal that's mad that you're trying to attach yourself to him. And you're in a small boat with sharp tools, bobbing around, and the smells and the fear, it must have been unbelievable.
You know, thinking about what it would be like to be in a small boat, you know, less than half the size of this animal, rowing up alongside this animal while it's alive, and then really wanting to poke it with a sharp stick.
It was actually very hard for me to be there at first when it was dead. I sort of needed to take some time off. I didn't show up on the beach again for about half a day, just to be able to separate myself from the struggling animal to the scientific research that needed to be done.
Now, it's natural to think that everything you find on the beach you can keep. And there was this feeling that the whale had somehow been given to us. But of course, it wasn't long before someone realized that whales are protected by the federal government, even dead ones, and that you need a permit to display them. So some people started working immediately to do whatever it would take to keep the whale here on the island.
We don't have front-end loaders and giant house-moving equipment, so we were able to contact several local contractors who donated an enormous amount of time and their machinery to pull this huge whale up onto the beach so that people from off-island, scientists, could come and study it.
The scientists from the New England Aquarium did an investigation, but no one could say for certain what had killed the whale. I mean, there was speculation that it was suffering from an infection that had weakened it, and some thought maybe it had collided with a ship somewhere off in the shipping lanes.
I think it was a variety of things. As any creature who hunts for its food becomes weakened in any way, it's sort of like a domino effect. They can't hunt as effectively, so they're not getting the nourishment they need. They found when they were doing the necropsy of the animal that it had some broken ribs that had apparently occurred previous to this particular stranding.
During that time, I was working for the Nantucket Historical Association, and as we were preparing to start the cutting-in process, we had to basically come up with two things. The first were volunteers who would assist the New England Aquarium's marine mammal necropsy team, and the second thing we were told to bring were lots of large, sharp knives.
This is a knife that we use to cut fish. It's called a Dexter knife. It's a company that makes it. It's got a 12-inch blade, very flexible, and very easy to put a really razor-sharp edge on.
And one of those great moments of irony? The people cutting up the whale found that the tools that the whalers had used 2 centuries ago work better than today's tools.
We had brought out a tool for everyone. However, we found the way for us to be most efficient was to have one person working, another person behind them sharpening the tool, and handing the tools back and forth as we made our way through the whale.
And we hook up a section of the blubber to the backhoe that was there, and he would pull on it, and we would lance it with the knives, or peel it, and they just peel all the fat off. And then once we got all the blubber off the whale, we started dissecting the bones.
So much of whaling today, I think, is romanticized and a bit glorified, and it's easy to overlook or not understand exactly how nasty and smelly and dangerous whaling was as a job.
A Nantucket whale ship was really a factory ship in many ways, because once they had killed the whale, they had to chop it up into pieces of blubber and then boil it into oil. And it was a dirty, dangerous business that could take more than a week and just cover them with a slick of oil and soot and blood. And it was really not a nice occupation.
I wore a pair of waders and a rain jacket that was neoprene rubber, and not only did the outer layers stink, but the inner clothes underneath it were so bad that when I'd come home at the end of the day, I would undress outside. I could just imagine being out in the South Shore on a hot summer day with a big southwest wind blowing and smelling one of those boats long days before anybody even saw it on the horizon, knowing, hey, there's a boat coming, we can smell it. I mean, because they just must have permeated every inch of those boats.
To cut a large whale, say a 90-barrel whale, will employ a ship's company from the captain to the cabin boy for the better part of a day. There is a cavity in the head containing 6 to 10 barrels, or even 14, sometimes called the case. It is bailed out with a large bucket. Captain John Hussey, whale ship Aurora.
And inside the jawbone of the whale is this bulb, this bladder, almost like. So we're like, okay, and how do we get the oil out of this thing? So we just stuck a knife in it like you would tap a tree for sap, pulled the knife out, and this stream of this clear, it looked just like water, started pouring out of this bladder in the head.
And of course, since this was something that whalemen saw every day, it was never something that was really described. And we were expecting a white, oily goo, but what we found is that when it first came out of the whale, it was perfectly clear. It looked like water, like vodka.
So we stuck a 5-gallon bucket underneath it, filled it, stuck another 5-gallon bucket underneath it, filled it. We had like 20 buckets. And we filled the 20 buckets, and there was still all this oil coming out. So we're like, well, what are we going to fill now? Well, Pete had a skiff in the back of his truck, so we ran and got the skiff, and we stuck the skiff underneath this head of this whale, and it filled the entire skiff up. And we had, I don't know, it must have been 50 gallons, 100 gallons of the stuff. It was a lot of oil. We couldn't believe how much was in there.
In addition to relating it to the heritage of the whaling, it tells its own story. We believe that the spermaceti organ, the case, is really a buoyancy control mechanism, which is really quite marvelous. This animal lives in a niche where no other mammal survives and can do so because of the case. So I think it deserves some attention.
Well, my friend Rick Markham worked for the Historical Association, and he called me up one day and said we had a bit of a problem with the whale bones, and he had tried cleaning the bones by burying them in the ground at Michael Amp's pit in cow manure and horse manure, and that didn't work out very well.
Eventually, the bones were sunk in the harbor. The idea was that the fish and the crabs there would clean the flesh off the bones, and it worked. But even today, the bones still leak a bit of the same oil that sent Nantucketers to the other side of the world.
We put the bones right up next to the lighthouse here, right on the other side of that dock right there. It was like you put an old car engine in the water because the spermaceti oil came out of the head all summer long, and there was a slick on the water.
I think the art in what I do really has to do with providing a structural assembly to support the bones. In this particular case, the entire skeleton weighs a couple of thousand pounds, maybe as many as 4,000 or 5,000 pounds. As they go further back in the tail, the individual bones are longer. So this is the way that I'll put it together, be able to tell how it goes back together. So what we do essentially as articulators is create an internalized steel skeleton for the skeleton, and we could think of this much like we could think of beads being strung on a necklace.
It's a part of my ambition to share my love and interest in whales with the greater public, and doing so with the skeletal features close up really gives me appreciation for whales that I can't obtain from watching live whales in the field. We only see them for moments as they come to the surface for a breath of air. And so the opportunity to look and study, examine the physical anatomy close up really completes an understanding of how the whales work ecologically as well as anatomically.
The inhabitants of the barren island of Nantucket have taken up this fishery, invited to it by the whales presenting themselves on their own shore. Thomas Jefferson, Observations on a Whale Fishery, 1788.
This was history that wasn't in a book. It wasn't an object that's 100 years old in a glass case. This was a chance to see how the process worked firsthand. The interesting thing was not, in a lot of ways, wasn't just to see the whale. It was at the end of the day when certain groups of mussels really ached, and realizing that on board a whale ship, as someone who had just signed on board working on their first whale, these were the same kind of mussels that would have been in agony.
All right, you can read about whaling in novels and books, Moby Dick. When you're up close and personal with the whale bones and the smell and the feel of all this stuff, it changes your perspective on it quite a bit. It makes you think that these guys had a real tough life.
Because I think instinctively, again, everybody knew this was something important, and that the skeleton was this lasting symbol of the island's, increasingly distant past. And this was their way of connecting to generations long gone.
And yeah, it is pretty weird to just be sitting here with bones in the background and know that that was once a living creature.
When it came to sheer velocity over the water, a Nantucketer pinned to the flank of a whale that was pulling him miles and miles from a whale ship that was already hundreds of miles from land was the fastest seaman in the world, traveling at 15, some claimed as many as 20 bone-jarring knots.